This video is sponsored by War Thunder. Tokyo, May 15th, 1932. About 6 p.m. Prime Minister Inukai Tsuyoshi, by now 76, preferred talk to action, which is why, as 5 uniformed military officers burst into his apartment, guns drawn, he asked them to sit and discuss their concerns. Taken aback, they holstered their weapons and followed the elder statesman to a nearby room, where Inukai invited them to sit on tatami mats and inquired why they were here. To kill him, the leader of the group stated flatly. Inukai chuckled and replied that of course he knew that. But why? Exasperated, the officer insisted that Inukai was ruining Japan by restraining the military from invading China and attacking the United States. Inukai, unsurprised at the young man's hot-headedness, took a deep breath and began to explain that Japan was in no position to... He paused at the sound of someone running and turned his head to glimpse another uniformed officer rushing into the room, knife in hand, shouting, "No use talking! Fire!" Months earlier, elsewhere in Tokyo, on February 9th and March 5th, 2 close friends, Onuma Sho and Hishinuma Goto, stood waiting. Onuma outside Kumamoto Elementary School and Hishinuma outside Mitsui Bank. Each held a revolver in his pocket, but Hishinuma also possessed 2 other items. A picture of a man, the business magnate Dan Takuma, and a fragment of paper on which was scrawled the phrase, "Namu Myoho Renge Kyo." They are the words of a Buddhist chant known all too well by Onuma, who spent all day prior to his arrival at the school repeating it in meditation. They learned it together from an obscure, unlicensed priest who taught them, along with a dozen other devoted cultists, that Japan was being consumed by an evil which had to be destroyed. And so, at 8 p.m. on February 9th, when Inoue Junosuke, Japan's former finance minister, stepped out of his car outside Kumamoto Elementary School, and when, a month later, Dan Takuma approached Mitsui Bank, the 2 young men strode forward, raised their pistols, and... A year later, the cultists, now known across Japan as the League of Blood, stood trial alongside their priest. It was perhaps the highest profile trial up to that point in Japanese history, and when the terrorists explained their motives, the nation listened. They insisted they were acting on behalf of the emperor against a corrupt elite which was robbing the country blind and subjugating his imperial majesty. All they sought was a restoration of the emperor's power and the glory of Japan. But as the public sympathized with this romanticism, Judge Sakamaki couldn't care less. They had violated the law and murdered fellow citizens. Their motives were irrelevant. Instantly, Sakamaki was blindsided by public outrage, threats, and legal complaints alleging communist sympathies. He delayed the trial, but the deluge continued. So, he finally resigned. His substitute took a different tact, lauding the quote-unquote pure motives of the defendants and sentencing them to life in prison rather than death. In concluding the trial, he remarked that he hoped their sentences would soon be commuted with imperial amnesty. Yet the subsequent trials of Inukai's killers were even worse. Held across Navy, Army, and civilian courts to try the various conspirators, the most important proceedings were the military courts-martial. After all, these concerned the leaders of the plot and offered a crucial chance to chasten a growing fever of rebellion throughout the armed forces. In the Navy trial, the prosecutor made his position plain, stating, "No matter what the motive, unlawful action always retains its unlawful character. If for the sake of argument we approved the notion that purity of motive purifies action, then we would give rise to grave dangers and evils which would threaten the future of the state." The defense disagreed, averring that the murder of the prime minister was the act of a truly profound and sublime divine providence. The dying man toppled, and those who brought his death were destined to pull the trigger. Rather than them pulling the trigger, it was nature that made them pull it. In other words, it was destiny, a natural manifestation of a pure spirit devoted to the emperor, a sentiment echoed by a top general who declared these officers had not acted for fame or personal gain, nor are they traitorous. They were performed in the sincere belief that they were for the benefit of imperial Japan. Eventually, the judge more or less concurred, concluding, "Although their criminal culpability is truly significant,
The depth of their patriotism must be acknowledged.
In turn, for the murder of the prime minister and a broader botched coup attempt, the 6 Navy officers were sentenced not to death, nor to life in prison, but to a mere 15 years. Their army accomplices were let off even easier. This was the signal to every ambitious young officer. Plot your coups, carry them out. We will protect you. In truth, civilian government in Japan died in 1932 with Inukai Tsuyoshi. This was just the nail in the coffin. But why were so many military officers so hell-bent on destroying the civilian government? And how did they escape serious punishment? The answers lie in the origin story of modern Japan. A story of how Japan's military got away with terrorizing the country, brazenly murdering elected officials, and in the end, how they seized power and plunged the nation into a massive, devastating war. It's a story which begins in the 1850s, a time when Japan was in a weak position relative to America and Europe, possessing an undeveloped economy and an archaic feudal military. The ruling shogunate, powerless to resist Western pressure, thus accepted a series of unequal treaties, and fear spread that Japan would soon be reduced to a mere vassal of foreign powers. So began a widespread campaign of terrorism carried out by nationalist revolutionaries who, united under the slogan Sonojoi, or Revere the Emperor and Expel the Barbarians, sought to oust the weak ruling shogunate and restore the Emperor Meiji to power. By 1868, they succeeded, and their triumph became known as the Meiji Restoration. Yet many of these revolutionaries had by then shed their xenophobia and adopted Western ideas about governance and modernization. Rather than instituting direct imperial rule, they established an oligarchy and embraced the so-called barbarians by pursuing Western-style reforms of law, politics, and industry. By 1889, they even went so far as to import a European-style constitution. Modeled after a German example, it hardly drew any inspiration from Japan's history or tradition. And though it appeared to restore the emperor to supreme power in Japan, in effect, it subjected him to a series of bureaucratic systems and procedures, preventing imperial rule by decree and entrenching the new oligarchy. Quote-unquote imperial decisions, including military commands, were usually made by a small circle of unelected advisors. For many who still believed in the revolutionary slogan of Sonojoi, this was a bridge too far. This Meiji Restoration was a fraud. And so many returned to arms against their former comrades in the government, unleashing a new wave of terrorism, which that same year saw an assassin hurl a bomb at the foreign minister. Afterward, the bomber bowed toward the imperial palace and killed himself. The minister, however, survived and bizarrely eulogized his would-be killer, opining,
"He is truly a wonderful person. I am touched by the bravery, even foolhardiness, of throwing a bomb at myself, the foreign minister."
Because this mentality wasn't foreign to the minister. He too had once been a revolutionary devoted to the precepts of Sonojoi, an ominous signal that Japan's leaders could tolerate terrorism as long as it had righteous motives. This warrior ethos is essential to understanding Japan in the 20th century, especially in the Second World War, which was rapidly approaching. For a more visceral understanding, however, check out this video's sponsor, War Thunder. War Thunder is the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made, and is available for free on PC, consoles, and now mobile devices. Take command of over 2,500 intricately detailed tanks, planes, helicopters and ships of 10 major nations, ranging from biplanes and armored cars of the 1920s to the mid-century Japanese Mitsubishi Zero and the fighter jets and main battle tanks of today. Instead of simple hitboxes and health points, War Thunder immerses you in the action by precisely simulating vehicle damage. Use the X-ray view to see how a shell penetrated an enemy tank and blew it to pieces. Better yet, with 3 game modes ranging from fast-paced arcadey fun to hyper-realism, War Thunder has something for everyone, even those without a PC or console, because now War Thunder is available on iOS and Android too. So, whatever your device, You can download War Thunder for free right now. Jump straight into customizing your tank or plane into a one-of-a-kind machine, then immerse yourself in the intense combat of War Thunder, where incredibly detailed vehicles, realistic graphics, and authentic sound effects make the finest game ever made for fans of military history. And for a limited time only, new and returning players who haven't played in 6 months who use our links below will receive an exclusive bonus pack, including multiple premium vehicles, an exclusive vehicle decorator, 100,000 silver lions, and 7 days of premium account so that you can hit the battlefield running. So use our links and jump into War Thunder for free today. Now, back to Japan. Still, there was one Western concept about which the oligarchs agreed with these radicals. They both hated democracy. However, it seemed to those in charge that a small concession to a sliver of the public could be valuable to solidify their legitimacy. So this new constitution also established a national legislature with the barest democracy possible. Its upper house was hereditary, and less than 1% of Japan's population could vote in the election of the lower house. In turn, this Diet, a German name, introduced a tiny modicum of democracy to Japan. Yet what began as a mere inkling soon grew far beyond the expectations of the oligarchs, as members of the Diet's lower house immediately pushed their power over the national budget to the limit, challenging the supremacy of the oligarchs and emperor. In turn, its powers slowly grew. In 1918, a commoner was appointed prime minister for the first time, and with him soon came two crucial reforms that not only strengthened the Diet's lower house, but made it far more democratic. The first was the precedent set by his own election, because from then on, prime ministers would largely be drawn from the ranks of the elected members of the Diet or the leaders of elected parties, rather than bureaucrats, aristocrats, and military officers as was previously the norm. Moreover, government cabinets were also reformed to reflect the Diet's political parties rather than just the old guard. These were serious leaps forward in the democratization of Japan, which, before being cut tragically short in 1932, saw some further crucial advancement in the form of massive suffrage expansions. In 1918, just 5% of the adult population of Japan had the right to vote. To join this small club, you had to be a man, and you had to pay at least 10 yen every year in taxes. But in 1920, the Diet reformed the rules, doubling the population with access to the vote. And just 5 years later, in 1925, Japan finally saw universal male suffrage, this time nearly quadrupling the number of enfranchised citizens to nearly 40%. Suddenly, the Diet was accountable to a huge swath of Japanese society, its leadership composed of actual elected representatives. This sea change was summarized in a single groundbreaking word coined by an elder statesman, minponshuki, meaning roughly the principle of the people as the base. In other words, where political power in Meiji Japan had once flowed from the top down, it was starting fitfully to flow in the other direction, from the bottom up. Yet this process was fundamentally disadvantaged. Japan was becoming more democratic in spite of the oligarchic Meiji constitution, not because of it. Imperial advisors, the Privy Council, the Diet's upper house, and most importantly, the military were autonomous, outside of any form of popular control. The emperor and his advisors still got to appoint the prime minister and his cabinet. Choosing them from the lower house and the political parties was merely a novel convention, not a rule. Expansion of suffrage meant only so much under these conditions. So Japan was at a crossroads, with real democratic progress made, but a lot left to go. Further democratization was possible, but it would depend on the civilian government and political parties remaining popular, proving themselves capable of solving the nation's problems and confronting those who sought to revoke the people's power. But as the Roaring Twenties drew to a close, the cracks already began to show. Corruption long plagued the unaccountable Meiji oligarchy, but the expansion of the Japanese electorate didn't seem to change the problem. Elected representatives proved eager to leverage their newfound power into bribes from Japan's massive industrial firms looking for lucrative government contracts. Moreover, competing parties did little to offer competitive policy visions to the public, instead focusing on exposing their rivals' corruption. And finally, every time a party was in power, it used its authority to tilt the electoral playing field in its favor. ensuring that no election held during this period was truly free or fair. As one leading Tokyo newspaper put it at the time,
"The political parties have almost completely neglected to engage in debate and examination of national policies and instead make frantic efforts to expose scandals and look into the secrets of their enemies."
It was a cycle of hypocrisy and naked self-interest that generated skepticism among the public and fertile grounds for the rejuvenation of the revolutionary ethos of Sono-Jōi, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians, especially among the officer corps of the military. Yet corruption and incompetence was merely the beginning of Japan's problems. By 1930, the Great Depression had made its way across the Pacific, and Japan was hit hard. Within a year, in rural areas, peasant household income dropped over 50%, while industrial production fell by more than 25%. In this era of hardship, a rash of tenant and labor disputes broke out, creating a sense of deep social unrest. The civilian government and the Diet proved unable to manage the crisis, refusing to pass any relief program for stricken farmers or the urban unemployed. Yet the most devastating incident for Japanese democracy would happen beyond its borders. Since their victory in the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, Japan had maintained an army garrison here, in the Chinese region of Manchuria, to guard one of their prizes, a critical railroad line. But by 1931, one staff officer was tired of serving as a mere railway guard. Ishiwara Kanji had bigger dreams, for himself and for Japan. He was convinced his nation had an international imperial destiny, and that it was locked on a path to conflict with the United States and China. Yet the timid civilian government in Tokyo thwarted that destiny by refusing to make war with China and humiliated the nation by agreeing to arms reductions treaties with America and Europe. So Kanji, in the spirit of those who once united under the banner of Sono-Jōi, determined he must act. With the help of a few close confidants, Kanji staged a bombing of the rail line and blamed the attack on Chinese troops. Back in Tokyo, the civilian leadership attempted to stop the army from escalating in response, but the local command indulged their own instincts without waiting for a signal from the Diet or the emperor. Within weeks, the Japanese army had launched a serious invasion. By the end of the year, Manchuria was all but conquered. Kanji's actions were a clear violation of Japanese law, but there would be no punishment. It certainly wouldn't come from within the military chain of command, and thanks to the convoluted and anti-democratic Meiji constitution, the civilian government had almost no leverage over the armed forces. So the governing cabinet simply approved the army's actions in Manchuria retroactively and then resigned. There was a brief attempt to form a unity government between the parties to rein in the military, but the preceding years of corruption and mudslinging had poisoned politics too much. They couldn't agree to work together. Instead, Inukai Tsuyoshi was named as the next prime minister in December of 1931. He immediately set to work attempting to pass relief for the Depression and address the military's growing power, but on both fronts, the damage was done. Japanese democracy was on its last legs. The military was fully free of civilian control, and the emperor himself was too intimidated to do anything about it. Yet, even so, the highest officers in the military couldn't simply step in and publicly dissolve the civilian government. Sono-Jōi meant that they couldn't be seen acting without the emperor's approval. But they could, as they'd done with Kanji, merely allow the zealots further down the chain of command to do their dirty work for them. Still, there was a civilian who would prove essential: Inoue Niso. Inoue had spent his youth aimless, existential, and cynical. In 1923, he finally found his calling when he returned to his home village in Japan, penniless from travels in China, and visited a Buddhist temple. There, after days of prayer seeking a path forward, Inoue heard a faint voice calling out to him, proclaiming him the future savior of his nation. Filled with a sense of purpose, Inoue developed his religious philosophy, a vision for how to save Japan. In short, he revered the emperor as divine and destined to unify the world into a single Japanese empire. But because the Meiji Restoration had betrayed the emperor, Japan needed a second restoration that would bring the country under direct imperial rule and destroy the corrupt ruling elites. His worldview was almost apocalyptic. As he put it,
"Destruction is itself construction, and the two are one and inseparable."
At first, this proved off-putting to potential followers, but as crisis gripped the nation and the politicians fell short, that changed. Inoue found his devotees among a small group of about a dozen young men, all unemployed and hopeless, thanks to the Great Depression of 1930. At around the same time, Inoue first made contact with a small cadre of young naval officers based near the temple where he worked, who shared his contempt for the civilian government. In 1931, Inoue relocated to Tokyo, where he and his followers earned the affectionate nickname the League of Blood from local arch-nationalists. The League was in Tokyo because Inoue had begun plotting an act of construction by deconstruction with his allies in the Navy. This was the plan. The League would strike at 10 captains of industry and important officials, while their allies in the Navy would work with some civilian and army accomplices to achieve the same in a second wave. But when the time came, 8 of the cultists lost their nerve, eliminating only 2 of their targets, Dan Takuma and Inoue Junosuke. But the plot was far from over. About a month later, the second wave of assassins descended on Tokyo. At about 6 p.m. on May 15, 1932, they broke down a door in the Prime Minister's residence and found their target, a meek old man who invited them to sit and chat. After Prime Minister Inukai's death, his assassins and more co-conspirators across Tokyo attempted to complete a total coup. Their failure was spectacular, and we cover it in detail in the bonus podcast available on our Patreon. But despite the hack job, it was clear the premiership was no longer safe for party politicians. There would be more kanjis, more Inoues, more renegade officers until the military got their way. So the emperor appointed a former admiral, someone his advisors hoped would satisfy the military without emboldening them to take further measures. By this policy of appeasement and the virtual acquittal of Inukai's killers in court-martial, Japan's war-hungry officer corps had succeeded in creating a permission structure within the military and Japanese society more broadly, which allowed for terrorism in the nebulous name of Sono-joi. But mere terrorism for terrorism's sake was not the end they had in mind. They wanted power, and they wanted war. For the next 4 years, the military continued to assert its independence until, following one more junior officer coup attempt in 1936, the government finally threw in the towel. Less than a year later, Japan, finally under military dictatorship, provoked a second massive escalation with China, initiating the Second World War in Asia. It would go on to cost nearly 30 million lives and ended with the military government's unconditional surrender. It can be said, then, that Japan's Rubicon, its final terrible turn to fascism and war, was in 1932. Yet the insanity of this year owed so much to the Meiji Restoration of 1868, a revolution from above which explicitly rejected democracy and enshrined the military's independence from the rule of law in a deeply flawed constitution. Ironically, this constitution also built the very institutions that would challenge the oligarchy's rule. By 1918, a new crop of politicians who owed their success to Japan's limited electorate were rising in prominence and prestige, and the imperial court had to accommodate them to maintain stability. Reluctantly, the old guard handed some power to these politicians, who used the opportunity to expand suffrage. But hobbled by their own self-interest and the continued existence of unaccountable institutions, including the military, the politicians failed to establish the legitimacy of this new semi-democratic regime. Moreover, their incompetence exacerbated the crisis of the Depression, leaving them open to attacks from the forces that had been reluctant to share power in the first place. Throughout all of this, the military continued to play a prominent role in politics, and it would be the actions and selective inactions of the armed forces that would play the decisive role in destroying Japan's struggling democracy. Indeed, in the words of the political theorist and former Spectacles guest Francis Fukuyama, absent an autonomous military, it would be perfectly possible to posit a counterfactual history where Japan evolved in a more English-style democratic direction. The struggles of the civilian government were the necessary precondition for the failure of democracy. But without a military constitutionally insulated from civilian authority and the rule of law and possessed by Sono-joi, a nationalist ideology that Fukuyama says celebrated the honor-bound ethos of the old military aristocracy, it's possible that the struggles of Japan's early elected politicians would have been nothing more than a period of trial and error out of which the democracy emerged stronger and more legitimate than before. In the apocryphal words of Prime Minister Inukai Tsuyoshi, if we create a period when dishonest acts of officials are done away with and politics are discussed by means of true words, assassinations would disappear. Though this would sadly not come to pass in his time, the failure of democracy in pre-war Japan was hardly inevitable. It was killed in its infancy by men with guns, who, at the critical moment, decided that it was no use talking anymore. August 17th, 1949, 3:09 a.m. Passenger train 412 is approaching the village of Matsukawa, Japan. So far, the journey on the Tohoku main line has gone smoothly, but disaster is only 60 seconds away. For the last 2 months, Japan has been inflamed with railroad terrorism. In July, the president of the Japanese National Railway Authority was kidnapped and run over with a train. Days later, someone tampered with another train, causing it to lose control and crash into a platform, killing 6. And here, someone has removed pieces connecting 2 portions of the track and shifted the rails several feet apart. Disaster is only 30 seconds away. The motive for all these attacks is obvious. Since July, over 100,000 railroad workers have been fired. Between the public and private sector, over 2 million have lost their jobs, while Japan's economy remains shattered by the Second World War. Despair is widespread, and communists have been growing in power throughout the country's powerful trade unions. They were the first to lose their jobs in July. And now, disaster is only... Train 412 derails catastrophically. 2 men are killed instantly, 49-year-old engineer Ishida Shozo and 27-year-old fireman Ito Toshiichi. The assistant engineer, 23-year-old Mogi Masaichi, lives just long enough to gasp to the train's conductor, "The train was sabotaged." But who did it? 20 communists were quickly charged and convicted. Their motive, like I said, was obvious. But why did they have a motive? Why were so many people fired so quickly? And why were communists the first to go? It wasn't a policy the Japanese had decided on. Instead, it was imposed by American authorities who had occupied the nation since the end of the war. Officially, they were there to help Japan transition from a bellicose imperial state into a pacifist democracy. And when the occupation began, that's what they did. But over the last year, that mission faded into the background. Now, America was intent on releasing war criminals from prison, locking up communists instead, and returning Japan's wartime leaders to power, even if it meant using the CIA to fund their political campaigns. So the communists struck back, at least that's what everyone thought. Except, after 14 years of trials and retrials, those 20 individuals were ultimately acquitted by the Tokyo High Court. The whole thing was a sham. But if they didn't do it, who else had a motive? According to the accused, they were set up, framed for an inside job by the American authorities who sought to paint communists as terrorists, to validate and accelerate their pivot away from an inclusive democracy and toward anti-communism. The question of who really sabotaged the tracks at Matsukawa is one that goes to the heart of Japan's post-war history, how it became the nation we know today. And it's a dark story of how an idealistic mission transformed into a cynical plot to bend Japanese politics to American ends, whatever the cost. Bribery, theft, espionage, even a prime minister on the CIA payroll. Japan 1949 is the story behind the scars, the deep wounds in the country's democracy that have never truly healed. The story of Matsukawa is the story of a battle between democratic idealism and cynical anti-communism. And that story begins with this, the Constitution of Japan, Exhibit A, the idealist's greatest achievement. It was adopted in 1946 by the Japanese Diet, or legislature, but it was not written by them. Instead, it was drafted by the Americans who, after World War II, occupied Japan, political scientists, legal scholars, and historians, and the occupation's supreme commander, Douglas MacArthur, the idealist-in-chief. The Constitution exudes idealism. Article 9 renounces war forever, a vital condition given Japan had recently started a conflict that killed 30 million people throughout Asia. Articles 11 through 40 enshrine individual rights, including the classics like freedom of speech, political participation, and religion, but also some absent from the American Constitution, like rights to equal education, academic freedom, freedom of thought, privacy, and crucially for the Matsukawa case, freedom of workers to organize and bargain collectively. In the same spirit of idealism, MacArthur's very first act as head of the occupation was not to punish, but to liberate, freeing all of Japan's 2,500 political prisoners, including many leading communists. At the same time, he gave 200 of Japan's wartime leaders the opposite treatment. Deeming them most responsible for instigating the war, MacArthur labeled them Class A war criminals, banished them forever from public office or government employment, and imprisoned many of them to await trial for their crimes. Idealism was on the march, but the tragedy at Matsukawa was brewing already, because that idealism had blind spots. Because MacArthur's idealism didn't stop at politics. He also set about building a democratic economy, which meant dismantling the zaibatsu, or megacorporations, and generally deconcentrating economic power. Conspicuously missing from these objectives in the war-shattered country, however, was economic growth. And so we land at Exhibit B, the bulletin board, the primary means of communication amongst the working class. All over Japan, advertisements for communist gatherings appeared on these boards as newly released party members rebuilt their power. At the same time, MacArthur's democratic economy froze. Growth went flat, and unemployment exploded. In turn, support for the communists grew, catapulting them into leadership roles in Japan's constitutionally empowered labor groups, including the National Railway Workers Union. One former president of a labor group recalled,
"MacArthur, in the early stages of the occupation, didn't merely tolerate, but welcomed the participation of communists in such important bodies as the Central and Local Labor Relations Commissions."
It was, of course, merely an extension of MacArthur's and the occupation's democratic idealism. Everyone had a right to participate and express their beliefs. But new centers of power were developing under MacArthur's nose, particularly the occupation's secretive military intelligence unit, G2, headed by MacArthur's close confidant, Major General Charles Willoughby, who was increasingly skeptical about the wisdom of MacArthur's idealism. To Willoughby, the great threat wasn't a resurgence of the militant nationalism that had just caused the war, as MacArthur feared. It was communism. So Willoughby exploited G2's secrecy, went behind MacArthur's back, and began building an anti-communist spy network in Japan. To do that, Willoughby needed expertise, and he needed money. He needed Kodama Yoshio. In China, Kodama hadn't just been a vital intelligence officer in the Japanese invasion and occupation, which killed tens of millions. He'd actually made off with $175 million worth of stolen Chinese gold and diamonds. He was exactly the sort of man G2 needed, but he was also exactly the sort of man MacArthur locked up and branded a Class A war criminal. But by 1948, the ground was shifting beneath MacArthur's feet. Communists were turning the tide in China's civil war, and rumors swirled that a Soviet-backed invasion of Korea was on the horizon. And so we arrive at the doorstep of the Matsukawa incident, Exhibit C, the Ryder Letter. Penned by one of MacArthur's subordinates, General Charles Ryder, in October 1948, it's nothing less than a mutiny against MacArthur's idealism.
On the one hand, we find ourselves bound to act in the best interests of the United States government in handling the communist problem. And on the other hand, we as an occupying force are committed to the sponsorship of a democratic form of government in Japan. Can we then maintain Japan as an oasis in which communism may flourish, in direct opposition to the stated position of the United States government? The answer is an emphatic no.
In other words, according according to Ryder, it was time for democracy to take a back seat to national security and anti-communism. And Washington agreed. That same year, George Kennan, the architect of America's Cold War strategy, traveled from Washington to Tokyo to read MacArthur the Riot Act. His demands were in line with Ryder's criticism: end the ambitious economic experiment, reduce the influence of the communists, and begin releasing Class A war criminals from prison. Matsukawa was now inevitable. By December, Kodama Yoshio was a free man, and he was soon working with Willoughby's G2 to smuggle precious metals out of China, Kodama's specialty, to fund the Takamatsu Plan, a blueprint for a vast and centralized Japanese intelligence operation to fight communism at home and abroad. Meanwhile, in February 1949, Joseph Dodge, a Republican bank president, arrived in Japan. Officially, he was sent by President Truman as a financial advisor to MacArthur. In reality, he was there to take charge and attack the root of communist power in Japan, MacArthur's stagnant, democratic economy. Dodge's message to Prime Minister Yoshida was clear. He would have to pass a balanced budget, and that meant slashing government spending. It took months of wrangling before Yoshida finally caved, but in April 1949, Japan's Diet passed the budget. Now, the scary part. The government had to fire about 30% of its employees. The Japanese National Railway Authority, or JNR, alone had to shed 100,000 jobs. On July 1st, each railroad division received orders from JNR President Shimoyama Satonori in Tokyo with the numbers to be fired, or kubikiri, translated literally, decapitated. Officially, the firings were to be decided according to efficiency and seniority, but influential communists were among the first to figuratively lose their heads when the layoffs began on July 4th. The next day, JNR President Shimoyama suffered a more literal kubikiri. He was found in pieces, scattered around railroad tracks in Tokyo, run over by a train. The official autopsy determined, on account of the minimal blood at the gruesome scene, that Shimoyama had been dead for some time before someone laid his body on the tracks. Despite his murder, though, on July 14th, the second and final round of kubikiri carried on as planned. The next day, a train careened into the suburban Mitaka station, killing 6 waiting passengers. Its controls had been tied down, causing the crash. And on August 17th, far from Tokyo, passenger train 412 derailed near Matsukawa, killing 3. In all 3 attacks, authorities quickly blamed communists in the railroad labor unions. The cause for suspicion in the Matsukawa case is obvious. For one, railroad workers, railroad terrorism, connect the dots. But more importantly, the communist workers had clear motive and means. As for motive, 100,000 railway employees had just been laid off. And the only thing that angers communists more than mass layoffs are mass layoffs that especially target communists. As for means, railroad sabotage isn't an easy business. It requires heavy-duty tools not readily accessible in post-war rural Japan, unless you happen to work in railroad maintenance. But even with the tools, a lone saboteur couldn't manage it. This had to be a conspiracy. And nothing rhymes with conspiracy like communists. Despite the clear motive and means, however, the only physical evidence was a couple of tools, apparently stolen from a nearby JNR rail maintenance supply shed. But the shed was broken into, so that didn't actually prove the conspiracy involved workers with access to it. What the police did have were confessions. They picked up a former rail maintenance worker, 19-year-old Akama Katsumi, in September. 10 days later, Akama confessed and named 4 communist union members in Matsukawa as the ringleaders. One of them then did the same, naming a handful more communist accomplices, and so on until the police had 20 communists under arrest. Except there were a few problems. For one, as time went on and new evidence arose, police invited their suspects to revise their detailed confessions to remain consistent with the facts. So much for reliable evidence. For another, internal police documents later revealed that police focused almost exclusively on members of Japan's railroad union. ignoring other possible suspects. And finally, not all 20 suspects were communist. In fact, one wasn't. The one who kicked it all off by fingering a handful of communists in the first place, teenager Akana Katsumi. And he only confessed after police threatened to kill him and told him some communists had already blamed him and that he should get even with them. And those are just the highlights of the shoddy police work. I mean, this rabbit hole is deep. If you want more, check out our podcast on Patreon and Nebula. But that's enough to get us set up and look at the alternative theory, that this was a frame-up job by the American government. For one, the motive is equally obvious as the communists. Willoughby's G2 had one mission: disrupt the growth of communism. We know their Japanese agents like Kodama were engaged in shady activity like smuggling, often alongside American counterparts. It isn't a stretch to imagine a false flag, and what better way to do that than the Matsukawa incident? I mean, railroad workers, railroad terrorism, connect the dots. And in the aftermath of those layoffs, who else would anyone blame? Back then, though, almost nobody knew about G2. Back then, nobody knew a thing. There's a reason the case spent 14 years in court, in retrial after appeal after retrial, until the Tokyo High Court finally declared the defendants not guilty. It was a rural investigation with basically zero physical evidence to go off of. As a result, we'll likely never know who sabotaged the tracks at Matsukawa. But today, we do know some things they didn't know then. We know that G2 was building its strength, carrying out clandestine acts far more complex than this, like Kodama's smuggling plot. And we know the cynics like Willoughby couldn't have asked for a better excuse to justify abandoning Japan's democratic experiment and pivoting to anti-communism. Matsukawa, they argued, and most believed, was the culmination and ultimate indictment of MacArthur's idealistic project. Toleration, freedom, corporate trust busting, worker power. They were all mistakes which bolstered communism and inspired terrorism. And today, thanks to the slow declassification of documents, we know what happened next. We know that in 1949, everything changed. In short, the idealists lost, and the cynics took charge, undertaking a secret project to build anti-communist politics in Japan, whatever the cost. This is a letter from MacArthur to Prime Minister Yoshida from June 1950, before the trial of the accused saboteurs had even wrapped. MacArthur ordered him to remove and exclude the full membership of the Central Committee of Japan's Communist Party from public service. The Red Purge was no longer an unspoken priority like in 1949. It was now official policy. Those not quietly purged in the 1949 mass layoffs were quickly and loudly fired by 1950, thanks to Matsukawa. By 1951, as communists were being purged for their politics, Japan's recently freed war criminals were suddenly depurged, permitted to participate in politics once more, a darkly poetic reversal of MacArthur's first steps after the war to free political prisoners and punish war criminals. One of these collaborators was Ogata Takatora, a former top intelligence official in Japan's wartime cabinet and a suspected Class A war criminal. After being depurged, Ogata dove right back into politics, winning a Diet seat as a member of Prime Minister Yoshida's Liberal Party, Japan's main conservative party. His return to high office was swift. By 1953, the year after the occupation's end, he was Deputy Prime Minister. Yet America's war against communism in Japan didn't end with the occupation. It just went underground. This is a CIA memo from 1955 documenting a meeting between a CIA officer and an asset codenamed Pokapon. Pokapon's real name? Ogata Takatora. That's right. Ogata, by now the leader of Japan's ruling political party, was literally a CIA asset, and he delivered huge dividends. In this meeting, Ogata's providing his handler information that only someone in his position at the highest level of Japanese politics could offer. Information about the personalities of leading politicians, the dynamics of inter-party rivalries, and updates on a proposed merger between Japan's two largest conservative parties, the Liberals and the Democrats. Ogata assures his American handler that the merger to consolidate a single anti-communist conservative party is in its, quote, final stages, offers negotiation details, and predicts that he himself will become the first prime minister of this party. Unfortunately for the CIA, however, Ogata died unexpectedly in 1956. Luckily, for them, the roster of Japanese war criminals happy to take CIA money to combat communism ran deep. Next up to the plate was Kishi Nobusuke. Kishi had been imprisoned with Kodama Yoshio, and he was a special case because as a cabinet minister in 1941, he'd literally signed Japan's declaration of war against America. Yet in this bizarro world the anti-communists built, he didn't just return to politics. In 1957, he became the leader of the newly merged Liberal Democratic Party, making him America's most important ally against communism in Japan. That same year, he visited America to play golf with President Eisenhower and throw out the first pitch at Yankees Stadium. We can't say for sure whether Kishi himself was a CIA asset, mainly because there are loads of files on him that the agency still refuses to release. But we do know that it was during Kishi's tenure as leader of the LDP and Prime Minister of Japan that the party and its candidates began regularly receiving huge payouts from the CIA. Tens of millions of dollars were given to the party over the remainder of the 1950s and throughout the 1960s, which funded their rise to power in Japan. It's hard to overstate just how successful this CIA-LDP collaboration was. In the 70 years since the party's founding, it's been in charge of Japan for 65. But as the 1950s drew to a close, it wasn't yet clear just how dominant the LDP would be. On one hand, the economy was finally turning around. On the other hand, the Japanese left seemed to be getting their mojo back. Although the communists were sidelined by the Red Purge, the Japanese Socialist Party was a serious contender in the 1955, 58, and 60 elections. It was this very socialist threat that motivated the CIA to work so frantically to support and fund Kishi's LDP. Yet that nearly backfired, because a big source of the socialists' popularity was that even as nobody truly knew what was happening with the LDP and CIA, it wasn't a secret that Kishi was extremely buddy-buddy with America, and a lot of Japanese were by this point a little fed up with being treated like America's little brother. This all reached a head in 1960, another insane year that made Japan what it is today, so go watch that video next. Meanwhile, in 1959, Japan's Supreme Court granted the Matsukawa defendants a retrial, and in 1963, all of the defendants' convictions were, to the shock of Japanese society, overturned. They were acquitted on all charges. The defendants, thanks to rights enshrined in MacArthur's Constitution, then sued the government for redress, alleging they'd been intentionally framed at the behest of American officials. Yet they never were able to prove their case. Many government files on the period remain strictly classified. In turn, the Japanese people have been denied any real certainty about who was ultimately responsible for the deep and fatal divisions that plagued Japan in 1949. As such, there remains something unsettled, even warped about Japanese politics today, thanks to this turbulent period and the occupation's dramatic pivot away from idealistic democracy building to cynical anti-communist realpolitik. This pivot was, in some ways, built into the occupation process from the start. Regardless of the can-do, idealistic, and democratic spirit of the initial occupation and the constitution it produced, it remained an occupation. There was always a risk that the needs of Japanese democracy would come into conflict with the interests, whether real or merely perceived, of American officials and national security. That's the nature of an occupation. It's not a democratic process, but something imposed from above by a foreign regime with its own designs. That isn't to say, when we look at the broad sweep of modern Japanese history, that the occupation fell short of everything MacArthur hoped for. Japan today is a liberal democracy. The Matsukawa defendants received their day in court and were ultimately acquitted. Citizens enjoy civil and political rights, freedom to vote in fair elections, and a high standard of living in a market economy. But Japan's politics remain dominated by a single party, despite its unpopularity, despite many scandals. Perhaps because in the formative years of Japan's democratic culture, it was stunted, as clandestine American operations intentionally smothered political competition and produced a regime more tolerant of secrecy and corruption than of ideological diversity and disagreement, those essential qualities of a healthy democracy.
I received this afternoon a message from the Japanese government. I deem this reply the unconditional surrender of Japan.
There's this moment after World War II where the world is suddenly changing really quickly and Japan is being completely remade. Because armed with an unconditional surrender and the atomic bomb, America could do anything to Japan. But when soldiers under General Douglas MacArthur entered Tokyo, their assignment wasn't to punish the country that had just started a war that killed 30 million people. Instead, their task was to rebuild Japan, and more importantly, to transform it into a peaceful democratic nation. And today, that's what Japan has become, a democratic country famous for its technology and innovation, and for its peacefulness. But this American transformation didn't happen overnight, and its success was far from guaranteed. There was a time when anything was possible, a time when leading politicians declared friendship with communists and swore opposition to America, when massive crowds dominated the streets of Tokyo, storming parliament, attacking American officials, and chanting, "Yankee, go home," when many believed Japan was on the verge of a socialist revolution. That is until this wave of resistance hit its final crescendo, when in 1 year, 3 enormous events combined to set Japan on the path to becoming the country we know today. First, a new treaty with America. Then, the largest protest in the country's modern history. And finally, a brutal samurai sword assassination televised for the entire country to witness. But these 3 events don't just explain why Japan is the way it is today, because this story actually helps explain a fundamental truth about why every society is the way it is. This is Japan 1960, the year that made a nation. This is the year of blood. The American occupation of Japan began with nearly boundless idealism. Immediately, the political and military leaders responsible for the conflict were arrested, many charged with war crimes, while the emperor was forced to renounce his divinity and endorse a shockingly progressive constitution. This new founding document established Japan as a liberal democracy, of course, but it went further, guaranteeing equality between men and women, and enshrining the rights of workers to unionize and self-advocate, measures absent even from America's own constitution. At the same time, large farms were divided and redistributed, and massive monopolistic corporations were slated to be broken up. Old, hierarchical Japan was quickly giving way to a new, democratic Japan. But perhaps the biggest break from the past was the Constitution's Article 9. The Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right. Land, sea, and air forces, as well as other war potential, will never be maintained. These were massive, controversial social changes, but despite some discontent, Japan's path to democratic modernity seemed clear, until one day, everything changed.
Here in Russia, you see why we are spending billions of dollars in defense production.
Communism was spreading, and suddenly America was no longer basking in the post-war glow of victory. A new war was on, the Cold War. Idealism vanished. Instead of a progressive democracy, Washington now needed a forward military base with a stable, friendly government. Most of the war-era leaders, experienced and reliably anti-communist, were suddenly pardoned and allowed to seek political office. Few renounced their wartime actions. Instead, communists were now purged from the government, and many progressive policies favoring organized labor and the breakup of monopolies were abandoned, even reversed. Article 9 remained in force, but America did allow the formation of a small pseudo-military, the Japan Self-Defense Force. What came next, however, was downright humiliating. As a condition of the occupation's end, America proposed a treaty. It stipulated the American military could freely station and move troops throughout Japan, without being under any obligation to defend the country in the event of an attack, and the treaty had no expiration date. Japan had no choice but to accept. So by the time the American occupation ended in 1952, a lot of the early progress made restoring security, dignity, and self-respect to a new democratic Japan had been undone. This security treaty was humiliating, and it caused a serious identity crisis, as Japan was torn between that initial post-war optimism and a new Cold War pessimism, where nothing mattered except stability and anti-communism. A contest over the fundamental question of what kind of nation Japan was going to be.
So, Japan is gripped by an identity crisis. Two images show who was winning this fight by 1960 in the Diet, Japan's parliament. This shows how many seats each party controlled after the 1955 election. These are the two biggest parties, the Liberals and Democrats. They're both conservative, and they're totally dominant. But here's the Diet after the next election. The two biggest parties are just gone. Except they're really just hiding, because this is the Liberal Democratic Party, a sort of conservative super party formed in a merger that was actually organized in part by the CIA, who wanted Japan's anti-communist parties to join forces. Heading up the new party was this guy, Nobusuke Kishi, a war criminal and former minister in the wartime government. By 1957, he was prime minister, and he had two core goals. First, revise the Constitution, eliminate Article 9, and remilitarize Japan. And second, renegotiate the humiliating security treaty with America. Now, treaty renegotiation was widely popular in Japan, not just with the right wing. So when Kishi, after 3 years of haggling with the American government, secured key concessions, mandated consultation with the Japanese government about American troop movements, a defense commitment from America for Japan, and a 10-year term of treaty renewal rather than it being indefinite, he expected to be hailed as a hero.
But there were two problems. While treaty renegotiation was widely popular, revising the Constitution was anything but. Most Japanese wanted nothing to do with war, and eliminating Article 9 to remilitarize the country threatened a return to those dark days. Moreover, Kishi wasn't a hero. He was a horrible man who'd helped steer Japan into a devastating war from which he massively profited while the rest of the country suffered. He was also just elitist, arrogant, and corrupt. He openly disdained the media and the Japanese public as beneath him and centralized power in an inner circle of allies. Under Kishi, many feared a comeback of the old Japan. As a result, he'd galvanized not only the left, but a wide swath of Japanese society against him. And when he attempted to force through legislation expanding police powers to stifle this widespread public dissent, protesters took to the streets and forced him to back down. By January of 1960, even though he'd seriously improved the treaty terms, nobody trusted him, and mass resistance was guaranteed. Instead of calming things down, Kishi had fired the country up. The fight for Japan's future was getting uglier. But Kishi didn't care. He wanted to get the job done. Still, months of massive protests unnerved some LDP legislators, so he delayed the vote on the treaty until May 19th, the last day of the Diet's session. But even then, Kishi couldn't be sure he'd get his way. He needed more time. So he moved to extend the session, but the opposition saw it coming, and they blockaded the halls of the Diet, barricading the speaker in his office. Here was an unprecedented confrontation between the two sides of the core identity crisis facing Japan, and millions of Japanese across the country were watching it unfold on their television sets. For hours, it dragged on, until finally Kishi called police into the Diet, an unprecedented move, and had the officers physically carry the opposition members one by one, some literally kicking and screaming out of the building. Then, mere minutes before the session expired at midnight, a mass of officers assembled and forced the speaker through the remaining crowd and up to the rostrum. A 50-day extension was carried. But to everyone's shock, with only his own party present in the chamber, Kishi went further. He called an immediate vote on the treaty. It passed unanimously. That core conflict over Japan's identity was heating up, moving from the ballot box to boxing bouts, as both major parties resorted to force to either obstruct or jam through a political agenda. Kishi won this round, but the treaty's opponents weren't finished. In their view, Kishi had made it clear he'd stop at nothing to get his way, and maybe they should do the same. Crucially for the opposition, the Diet is bicameral. While the lower house voted on May 20th, Japan's upper house still had a say in the matter. They couldn't reject the treaty outright, but they could delay the bill until the next election, when a new lower house might reconsider. If the upper house didn't intervene, however, the treaty would automatically ratify in 30 days, on June 19th. Coincidentally, the very day President Eisenhower was scheduled to make the first U.S. presidential visit to Japan, convenient timing for a victory lap for Kishi. But hardly anybody in Japan wanted to grant him the satisfaction. Soon, hordes of citizens took to the streets every day, featuring a major protest somewhere in the country. The energy had transcended partisan politics to encompass a majority of the population. These weren't just student radicals or urban laborers, they were office workers and housewives. Even a number of conservatives, fed up with Kishi's suicidal politics, began funneling money from Japan's business establishment to left-wing groups organizing the protests. Still, the Diet's upper house wasn't budging. Yet. But the whole exercise was turning into a real problem for Kishi until on June 10th, just over a week before the treaty was slated to ratify, it got a whole lot worse. Ahead of his arrival, Eisenhower sent his press secretary, Jim Hagerty. But on the way from the airport to meet Kishi, Hagerty's car was assaulted by protesters who surrounded the vehicle, cracked the windows, and caved in the roof, all while shouting anti-American slogans. Eisenhower's security, and by extension the viability of his visit, was called into question. A massive embarrassment for Kishi and a coup for the protesters. It was a small victory, though, because time was running out. The protesters had staged massive demonstrations, unprecedented strikes, even intimidated the President of the United States. Yet still, the country was hurtling toward the ratification date without a hint of delay from the Diet. It was now or never. They needed to do something big. On June 15, 1960, tens of thousands of Japanese gathered before the Diet building. They were faced by 5,000 police officers. At first, the protests were non-violent. One group even managed to break into the Diet compound, where they peacefully occupied a garden, sang songs, and gave speeches. Elsewhere in the vicinity, though, a cohort of right-wing counter-protesters assaulted the demonstrators using planks driven through with nails. A melee ensued. Now things were completely out of hand. The police, who'd been instructed to exercise restraint, now decided the time for such things was over. They attempted to force the protesters out of the Diet compound, beating many of them unconscious. Blood began to run, instigating a mass panic. In the crowd crush that followed, Michiko Kanba, a female student at Tokyo University, was trampled to death.
Japan, fanatic students and leftist groups rioted for days on end.
By midnight, Kishi had given police full authority to clear the building out, but out here, the protest, inflamed by Michiko's death, raged on. Kishi contemplated calling in self-defense force troops, but his cabinet talked him down. Instead, he announced he would resign within the month. Eisenhower canceled his visit. It would be another 15 years before a sitting US president first set foot in Japan. Still, protests continued to rock the country, reaching their peak on June 18th, one day before the treaty's automatic ratification deadline. As one student protester put it, "Despite US approval of the new treaty, I felt certain that the revision would fail in the face of such widespread opposition, a conviction shared by the adults around me." However, the upper house remained silent, and on June 19th, the treaty was ratified.
In one sense, the Japanese left and the broader protest movement had failed. It was a critical victory for the conservative side of Japan's identity crisis. The treaty was ratified and the country had taken a clear step toward US alignment, which was more or less legally locked in until the treaty was due for renewal in 10 years. But in another sense, the opposition had scored a major victory. Eisenhower backed out and Kishi resigned, proving that two could play political hardball. In turn, neither had this episode truly settled the fundamental question about what kind of nation Japan would become. If anything, the choice in the upcoming elections seemed more polarized than ever, as the Socialist Party leader Inejiro Asanuma visited the Chinese Communists, still not recognized by Japan as the official government, where he treated with party chairman Mao Zedong, gave speeches declaring his friendship with China and opposition to America, and returned to Japan wearing Mao's signature outfit. Asanuma wasn't just a radical, he was popular. Famous for his shabby dress and for living in public housing his whole life, Asanuma connected with the public about as well as Kishi repulsed it. By contrast, if a Mao suit and shabby clothes defined Asanuma's radicalism and appeal, wire-rimmed glasses and double-breasted suits defined the LDP's new leader, Kishi's Minister for International Trade and Industry, Hayato Ikeda. This was the uniform of a graduate of an elite school, an economist and a finance minister. Hardly the look of a man destined to repair the party's elitist reputation. But it wasn't just Ikeda's clothing that seemed to doom his odds. Indeed, his party had chosen him because he was thought to be an empty shirt, someone with no real base of support within the party who could stand in until the impending election determined the better man for the job. After all, Ikeda's career was littered with political missteps. Back in 1950, he'd infamously suggested that Japan's poor should cope with high food costs by eating more cheap barley and less expensive rice, prompting comparisons to Marie Antoinette. Worse still, Ikeda had been trade and industry minister once before in 1952, but had lasted less than a month after he was quoted in the press remarking coldly,
"Even if 5 or 10 small businessmen commit suicide, it can't be helped."
Asanuma, the everyman, couldn't have asked for a better opponent. But he had more than Ikeda to contend with. On October 12, 1960, Inejiro Asanuma stood on stage for a debate inside this building in Tokyo, with Ikeda seated a few feet away in the front row. Millions were watching on TV when suddenly a man rushed on stage and seemed to collide with Asanuma. He wielded a wakizashi, a kind of short sword, and as he lunged at Asanuma a second time, he was tackled to the ground. But it was too late. The assailant's first strike had been a deep blow through the ribs. Asanuma died within minutes. It was Japan's first political assassination since the war. The killer was a 17-year-old right-wing radical who would hang himself in jail a few weeks later after scrawling, "Long live the Emperor," on his cell wall in toothpaste.
Most believed the murder would buoy support for the socialists, both for reasons of sympathy and because it reinforced the fear which spread under Kishi's leadership, that behind the LDP, in the shadow of Japan's right wing, lurked violence and terror. However, just days after Asanuma's death, Ikeda stood before the Diet to give a speech, where many expected characteristically direct and concise remarks, where Kishi might have even made a campaign speech. Ikeda shocked his colleagues by delivering an impassioned eulogy for Asanuma, reciting the lyrics from one of his 1920s campaign songs and commending his colleagues' commitment to the public good. His words left many in tears. But this wasn't just a one-off performance. The storming of the Diet had been traumatic, the death of a protester, tragic. But seeing a colleague stabbed to death mere feet away? That changed Ikeda. Gone were the wire-rimmed glasses and double-breasted jackets. He adopted chunky plastic frames and simple suits, the clothes of a man who no longer considered himself above the people. Nor was Ikeda's transformation limited to a new outfit. He now fully grasped the gravity of Japan's political chaos. He saw how Kishi's confrontational winner-take-all politics had taken his country to a very dark place. Politics was too existential, too polarized, too violent. In his campaign, Ikeda sought to bring himself closer to the people, touring the country to discuss food prices, unemployment, and other kitchen table issues, promising, if elected, to double Japan's national income within a decade and to abstain from the golf and lavish geisha parties so beloved by his predecessor.
It worked. In the 1960 election, the LDP gained a number of seats as Japan's left wing shrank. More importantly, Ikeda kept his word. While in office, he never did play golf, nor was he seen at any parties. He attended studiously to governance, and though he died of cancer before his promise to the nation could be realized, Ikeda's policies doubled Japan's national income in just 7 years. But his most lasting legacy was his abandonment of the LDP's platform of constitutional revision. Article 9 would stay. Japan would not remilitarize. But not everyone celebrated Ikeda's achievements. Kishi, for one, lamented the move away from constitutional revision, while many LDP members decried his administration in general as do-nothing, a critique Ikeda seemed to embrace. As his close confidant and future Prime Minister Kiichi Miyazawa recalled,
"The issue was not what policies should be followed, but how policies should be decided in the Diet. And this issue was not really a joking matter. In America or Britain, this how has been decided as the result of a long history and centuries of tradition. It might take Japan many more years to get to that point." Ikeda's attitude was that, in order to promote the healthy development of parliamentary democracy, the Conservative Party, but also the progressive parties as well, should exercise a bit more self-control. By nature, the younger the democracy, the more difficult and delicate this exercise of democratic leadership.
Ikeda didn't just moderate the LDP, he moderated Japan. By abandoning his party's more divisive and extreme policies, he diffused the most potent criticisms from Japan's left, resulting in a political system which the LDP has more or less dominated ever since. These highly stable politics have brought benefits, encouraging Japan's meteoric economic growth during the 1970s and 80s, while Ikeda helped institute a less winner-take-all, more consultative legislative culture in the Diet, but it has brought downsides as well. Political choice in Japan is very limited. Police regulations have rendered large-scale protests a nearly extinct form of political speech, and economic successes have given way to near-paralyzing stagnation. In one sense, this story is ultimately about one simple trade-off that defines practically every political question. This is a spectrum of political possibility. At the far left is chaos. Think of war, revolutions, even anarchy. There's no telling what politics might look like in a year, a week, even a day. The horizons of political possibility are wide, even boundless, but the cost of such opportunity is ever-present instability and the threat of violence. At the other end is autocracy. Politics is stable, consistent, and reliable. Society is largely static. When it's good, it's great. But when it isn't, there's little that can be done to change it. Most regimes fall somewhere on this spectrum, trading between the benefits of opportunity and stability. Of course, some regimes, like Putin's Russia, have the worst of both worlds. extremely narrow political horizons, and an unpredictable, ever-present threat of violence meted out by a capricious dictator. But the spectrum is useful because it articulates this principle, that to gain in either opportunity or stability requires some sacrifice in the other. A political system can't afford boundless opportunity and reliable stability and safety. Liberal democracy, as a regime, attempts to straddle the difference, providing democratic means to increase political choice and possibilities, while at the same time constraining that choice within inviolable principles of individual rights, increasing stability. Where exactly each nation sits varies, because every society, particularly its leaders, must make this choice in formative moments. For Japan, 1960 was that formative moment. And with the support of most Japanese, Ikeda made a choice. Faced with the horrors of pre-war fascist chaos, the devastation of a suicidal nationalist war, and the resurgence of domestic political instability and conflict, Japan chose stability. Japan chose economic prosperity, and in turn, Japan chose narrow political horizons, a system governed largely by one party, where political disputes are resolved quietly in backroom deals rather than in public brawls and polarized elections.
In many ways, Japan is less democratic for its choice, less responsive to the needs and demands of its people, and less tolerant of public dissent. However, it remains fundamentally a democratic society. At what point that trade-off between stability and opportunity, between safety and freedom, becomes unacceptable? It's a difficult question, indeed.
Remember to download War Thunder for free, whether you're on PC, PlayStation, Xbox, or mobile. To kickstart your engines, make sure to use our links in the pinned comment or video description for a massive bonus pack including multiple premium vehicles, in-game currency, and more. And if you made it this far, thanks for watching. If you enjoy videos like these, consider supporting our efforts to tell stories that matter to democracy by grabbing some merch like this poster, dropping a super thanks, or joining our Patreon. Thanks for watching.